Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for tonight's Film Studies Online discussion of Strangers on a Train. I am Andrew Douglas, Senior Director of Education and Administration at Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and I will be your sole moderator this evening. I'm very glad to be your sole moderator this evening because this is one of my favorite movies. And I already have a little bit of a hint from a couple of you who emailed me, at least one of you who emailed me, that you will not be adding this to your list of favorite movies, but we can talk about that. In the meantime, if you're new or would like a reminder, here are some guidelines on how to participate tonight. Please keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question. I will call on you to ask your question or make your comment, at which point I'd ask you to please unmute yourself and state your question or comment. And then when you're done, please go back on mute. I will know that you have a question or comment to make because hopefully you'll use the raise hand tool within Zoom that you can see marked by the number 2 on this slide. And you can also participate in the chat, which I will be keeping an eye on, as will my colleague Jill. And if anything bubbles up in there, we'll try to bring it to the whole group via the discussion. And that's about it. We'd love to know if you're new to this in the chat, particularly say, where you're from and how you found out about us if you haven't joined us before. But other than that, thank you for joining us. And let me see, who do we have tonight? Well, in a bit of a departure from common practice, looks like Jean edged out the Glussmans. So, Jean, what's your question or comment? Thanks for joining us.
Woohoo! I'm glad I finally saw this. It's taken me long enough, and I apologize for only having seen it last night. And so there are a couple of things, and I only was able to see it once. So there are a few things I just need to ask for clarification, because I think I may have missed something along the way. The first one is because Robert Walker knows so much about
Guy Haynes,
Farley. Yeah,
Farley Granger.
yeah. Since he knows so much about him at the start and seems so focused, is there any indication that he was planning that meeting, or is it pure coincidence?
Well, so this is a good question. And in the novel, which I haven't read, though, after loving this film for so many years, I think I might finally be inspired to read it or at least listen to it, which is how I get most of my fiction nowadays. The character that Farley Granger plays is an architect. And Alfred Hitchcock and his writers changed that occupation of that character to tennis pro. And I have to think that part of the reason they did that, was to facilitate their meeting, and to make the fact that Bruno would know some things, or in this case, a lot about Guy when they met. I don't think there's anything in the movie that suggests that he was stalking him. Now, that doesn't mean that, people are wrong for coming to that conclusion. But if you're asking me about in the text of the movie, I don't think there's anything in there that says to us he is. And as we know from what happens toward the end of the movie, or in the second half of the movie, it would appear that if Bruno had been stalking Guy would have noticed, because he would have been like standing on the steps of the Jefferson Memorial, or not watching a tennis match right, or some other really obvious thing. And he would have spotted him. So I have to think that it really was coincidence. But I see in the chat others disagree. And I think, there's enough room there to think that. But I don't think the movie makes it clear that he was stalking.
Right. Okay. Because that's why I had to ask. Because like I said, he did seem to know so much and was so focused, but then again, there was no other indicators. Although he was pretty good at following up everything after that, as far as being in the right place, and he became a stalker.
Yes, he certainly did become one. Whether it's, I don't think the movie suggests they start out that way, but we don't know.
Right. And then before I ask my second question, I just have to point out maybe my favorite shot, and it was the perfect setting for something with a little bit of humor, but it was the perfect environment for such a shot. To pick out one figure in a shot of a crowd, what better place than at a tennis match where everyone's heads are going one way to the left, right, and the one stationary one is so easy to find. It was just a perfect setup and perfect execution.
Yeah.
The other question I had was, maybe I missed something, but when Patricia Hitchcock runs into Robert Walker at the club, I guess it's club maybe, they look at each other as though there's a big backstory there, and I don't remember what happened before that and twice that happens between them, I think. But was there something that led up to that exchange?
He doesn't. He finds her. He thinks she resembles Miriam,
Oh, okay, gotcha.
and when he sees her sort of her sort of round, cloying face behind those glasses, it reminds him of Miriam, who we can, I think, assume was his first kill, and that was if you'll pardon the expression, a seminal moment for him. And so he is brought back there to the point of sort of, reliving it and losing control, as when he strangles that society woman, or begins to strangle that society woman at the party at the senator's house.
But she's also looking at him with an intensity that to me didn't feel like she was puzzled. It felt to me like she knew something or was
Yeah,
reading.
she can smell the psycho on it.
Right.
Remember, she's the one. There's this character. There are these characters, and this one of the reasons I love this movie so much is you hear a lot of people who aren't supposed to be interested in or take relish in the details of murder and crime and all those things. You see them doing it. The society woman at the party, the woman whose vehicle is commandeered by the police toward the end, and Patricia Hitchcock's character is the one who's saying everything that Anne Ruth Roman is too sort of polite to say, and her father is too reticent. The senator is too reticent to say, and so she really has an eye for this. It's just like the characters in Shadow of a Doubt, the husband and the husband's friend, played by Hume Cronin, who are just so into their murders and their mysteries. Yeah. And we hear throughout the movie that Patricia Hitchcock that Babs has been talking the cop's ear off about some of his cases. So she knows the murdering kind when she sees him, and she can tell he's the murdering kind.
Gotcha. All right, thanks.
Sure thing. Let's see. Glussmans, sorry you had to fall to second place, which is still very respectable and not at all just the first loser. So
I appreciate that. I think it was a technology problem this evening. On our end somewhere.
Come on, I'm just fast on the draw.
You certainly were fast on the draw, Gene. And Gene, I really love the picture you have up, because like all of the Hitchcocks, we all have to find his cameo. And this one was sort of tough to find because unless I missed a tenth of a second, we only saw his back as your picture shows getting on the train.
Right.
When you get around to it, Andrew, you can tell us the backstory of Hitchcock doing all of these 2 and 5 second cameos in all of his movies. But so a couple comments that will hopefully be food for your thought. Number one, not on my list of priority, but I was a little disappointed in Leo G. Carroll's taking his character, the senator. I thought he underplayed too much. I loved the way he filmed the murder scene with her glasses falling and then reflecting up from the glasses. That was both interesting and so Hitchcock, to the extent you feel like commenting on it. A couple substantive comments. In my research, I think I found out that Alfred Hitchcock actually was afraid of being accused of crimes in his real life, and that his father had sent him to a police station as a kid, and he either was locked up or told a cop to lock him up until somebody called for him, which is strange for anybody, and I guess would leave you in a state such as we find Hitchcock for most of his life, with these really, really weird things.
Well, and also I mean, he's doing this in England in the first decade, either the last decade of the 19th century or the first decade of the 20th century. So, I mean, he's not all that far removed from Oliver Twist times. And he's saying, you know, his father's teaching him a lesson by sending him to the constable. So that's a little much.
I'm glad my parents never tried to instill the fear of doing wrong things that way. I might not have come up as close to relatively normal as I hope I did. I also, when you chat about the casting, I understand that initially there were other characters that they had considered, including William Holden for Guy, and that they changed their mind because of the chemistry between these two and how well it reacted into the real story. And I guess last, I'll just mention, and Janice is sitting behind me, and I don't think she knows what I'm about to say. I understand that merry-go-round runaway scene was actually filmed real, and that it was not done in a fake manner, and that the stuntman, had he missed his cues and his height, would have been killed. And it sounds like a crazy way, even back then, for doing stunts. It really came across. I mean, Janice was petrified. So great film. I don't know if it's my top 5 or 10, but I was really, really glad you picked it. Really glad to watch it. And I'll listen for the rest of your thoughts. But thanks again.
Sure. Well, I'm really glad you liked it, and I will take any votes for people. I want honesty. I want honesty first and foremost, and I do not. A very long time student and a really wonderful person who's been taking classes from us for a long time sent me an email and let me know that she didn't think this was very good, and that's fine. I want to hear what people think. This movie, I can't say ended a friendship, but stifled a friendship before it could even start. Because the people I suggested it to thought, if this is what he thinks is a really good movie, then we don't need to spend so much time with him. So, you know, I'd love to hear what people think. But to get to some of your points, David, and I might need you to remind me, Hitchcock's cameos. Hitchcock, one of the reasons we all know him and his name is an adjective and all that is because from early on, from his, you know, when he first started getting direct films in England, he knew that he would be well served by cultivating himself as a brand name and as a known entity. And so he began appearing in cameos in his movies, in the movies he directed, pretty much as soon as he was allowed to do it, basically when he was sort of given the opportunity in the 1920s to direct films on his own. The cameos, however, start as he becomes more famous and as he moves, certainly after he moves to Hollywood, the cameos start coming earlier and earlier and earlier because he was concerned and had some anecdotal evidence to suggest that people weren't really paying attention to the movie. They were looking for him and waiting for him. So this one comes in, I think, something like 12 or 15 minutes after the movie starts. I mean, some of the ones in England, he comes in the last reel, like 5 or 10 minutes from the end. Even in Rebecca, I think he comes in the last 10 or 15 minutes, his first Hollywood movie. So he would eventually move earlier and earlier. And by the time you get to Psycho, he's there before the plot even really gets rolling. So but it's something he's always done it, and that's why he does it. And somewhere on YouTube, probably multiple places, there's a highlight reel of every one of his cameos, and I'm sure you can easily find that. The casting question. Hitchcock did not have this, as I mentioned in my introduction. This movie comes sort of when Hitchcock's on a kind of a downward slide in his career. He was under contract to Selznick. He had a lot of success with Selznick, both with Selznick when Selznick was producing and when Selznick rented him out to other studios. I mean, he made Rebecca, Shadow of a Doubt, Suspicion, Notorious under that contract, and a number of other movies as well. But once he was out from under that yoke, which he really, really resented being under that contract, he sort of got to write his own ticket, but it didn't go very well. None of the movies he makes before this one, while an independent, he's not technically an independent when he makes this one, but none of the movies he makes while he's an independent really sort of are in the upper, or I would even say sort of middle tier of Hitchcock movies like Stage Fright and I Confess and The Paradigm Case. They certainly have their fans, but nobody puts them on the Mount Rushmore, or even on the sort of in the visitor center near Mount Rushmore. And this is the movie that begins to turn it around, in part because, I shouldn't say in part because, I don't think it's coincidence that he is working under the watchful eye. He basically had his own production company after Selznick and before this, but he couldn't do it all himself. And the production company, he wasn't trying to do it all himself, but it's like a lot of coaches in sports. A lot of coaches want to be the coach and the general manager. Some of them are great at it, but some of them are better when they're, quote, to borrow a phrase, cooking with someone else's ingredients. George Lucas, is a very talented filmmaker, but he works better. He produces better work when he has other strong personalities, either as producer or in other roles, to sort of temper some of his tendencies. And I think, it's not uncommon for people like that, creative fields, to have that sort of element to their work. And so Hitchcock is working, Warner Brothers isn't riding him anywhere near the way Selznick would, but he does have to think about he has to listen to them. And one of the ways he has to listen to them is in casting. He didn't want Ruth Roman, and from this movie, I don't blame him, but he had to deal with her. And my understanding is he wanted Holden, but he couldn't get Holden. And this was, again, sort of at a downturn in his career when stars weren't dying to work for him. But as Roger Ebert says in his review of this, when he adds it to his great movies list, Holden wouldn't have been a good choice. And I think that's really pretty clear. Holden would have recognized, look, this is a Patricia Highsmith novel based on a Patricia Highsmith novel. In the novel, far more so than in the movie, but a little bit in the movie. There's certainly homoerotic undertones. And Guy is far too polite, or at least not passive, not aggressive, to do anything other than sort of gently condescend to Bruno after their first meeting and sort of think that's the end of it. William Holden would have seen what Bruno was and wouldn't have been so nice about trying to get rid of him. And then the movie would have really sort of ended. And so I think not having William Holden in the role, serves the movie well. I can't remember what else you asked about because I've talked for so long.
The scene underneath the merry-go-round.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Hitchcock really, there is some, when it finally explodes, that was done, the actual, sort of explosion of it. There's some rear projection used there, but yeah, that guy those people are on a merry-go-round, and that guy is crawling under the merry-go-round. And as you can see, when he gets up, the film sped up a little bit, but not too much. And Hitchcock, sort of after the fact, was sort of shocked with himself and said he would never take a risk like that again. He really sort of didn't know what came over him, and it was truly dangerous and could have been catastrophic. So he never took a risk like that again. Okay, let's see. Joss, good to hear you. What's your question or comment?
Nice to be back. It's been a while. As usual, an array of things. You mentioned the homoerotic undertones, and the Hirsches mentioned it in the chat. And I read, possibly in the Ebert review, that Hitchcock worked with Robert Walker in his gestures and mannerisms to suggest that idea without making it explicit, which it wasn't, to get around the code. So just, when I'm done, if you care to comment on that approach to the code at that time. In a similar vein, it seemed to me, a pretty clear Oedipal approach to Robert Walker's character and his relationship to his parents. I mean, he was very close to his mother, and there was a lot of almost, close to inappropriate affection traded between them. And his father didn't seem like all that bad a guy, although he hated him, from what little we saw of him. So I think that idea was there pretty clearly to me. A couple of other things about just the technique that Hitchcock used. Your first commenter pointed out that wonderful shot of the crowd where Robert Walker stuck out like a sore thumb, and that was, that was both clever, brilliant, and very funny, I thought. And I think I know for myself, I had a lot of fun watching this movie, just watching Hitchcock, almost watching him work. The setup for the tennis match, where he says, I'm going to win this match really quickly so I can get back to town to stop Bruno from doing the bad thing he's doing. And he gets delayed because he doesn't win the match all that quickly. And Bruno gets delayed because he drops the cigarette lighter down the storm drain, and that delays him. And it's this sort of cutting back and forth between the two of those that was both funny and built a lot of tension. And I thought that was, quintessential Hitchcock. He does that sort of thing all the time. One other unrelated element was the music, which was by Dmitri Tiomkin. And if you have anything to say about his body of work, I'd be interested to hear it. I mean, I think I'm most familiar with his score and song for High Noon, and for his score for The Thing from Another World, both done within 2 or 3 years of this film. So there's a bunch of stuff to chew on. Nice to be back. Nice to hear you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thanks, Joss. Yeah, so I think you touched on the other reason why it mattered to make the Guy Haines character something besides an architect. I mean, you can't have the same level of tension with I have to finish these plans as you can with a high stakes tennis tournament match. So that makes a lot of sense there. Regarding the code, yeah. So as those of you who've heard me before have probably heard me say, Hollywood, actually, even still in 1951, Hollywood movies do not enjoy First Amendment protection. And with the threat of censorship having had been implemented by states and localities in the first few decades of the 20th century, Hollywood finally agrees to censor itself in the early 1930s and comes up with a set of rules for things that can and cannot be depicted in their movies. And it's not just what we might think it would be based on the rating system. Things like you can't say these words, you can't show these actions, you can't show these body parts, you can't show this much blood. It's actually really about morality and their view of morality at the time, I should say, and what was appropriate and acceptable for all audiences. Because we have to remember, even though none of us could probably imagine saying, you know, I think it would be a good idea to take my 6-year-old to see Strangers on a Train, we can imagine Hollywood still clinging to their policy that all their movies should be for all people. That changes when they have, that's why they hold off on a rating system for as long as they do until 1968, because they're still sort of operating under this business kind of illusion, not that everyone's going to want to see every one of their movies, but that anyone could see one of their movies and that their movies should be appropriate for all people. By the way, I see in the chat, movies begin to get First Amendment protection in the 1952 Supreme Court case. You know, it's another discussion for another day, but it starts in the early 1950s, very shortly after this movie comes out. But nothing to do with this movie. That's just a coincidence of timing. So anyway, so one of the things they could not depict was homosexuality. It just wasn't going to be acknowledged, presented, discussed, you know, depicted in any way in a Hollywood movie at that time. So there've been documentaries on this and books on this. A lot of sort of coding, things that filmmakers did to try and suggest that a character was either was homosexual or some other kind of sexuality that wasn't sort of standard issue heterosexuality. Those of us who've seen Rebecca know that Mrs. Danvers is coded as a lesbian. This isn't a discussion of Rebecca, so we're not going to get into the ways that is done, but we see it and we know it. And Bruno, not as much as someone like, say, Joel Cairo, the Peter Lorre character in The Maltese Falcon, but to a fair extent, Bruno is coded that way as well. We see it from the beginning, right at the beginning, with his two-tone shoes and his lobster tie and his name tie clip and his flashy dress and the way he sort of lounges around in his cabin while he's in there with Guy, and his relationship with his mother and things like that. And his father saying he's mentally ill. I mean, he is mentally ill, and it turns out his father's right. He is a danger. But his father also presumably isn't thrilled that he senses in his son something that the film is, you know, kind of suggesting or identifying as homosexuality. So that's what the movie's doing, because that's all the movie can do. And so at that time, so that's how it does it. And the code isn't as strict in 1951 as it is in 1934 when it's first implemented, and different filmmakers are given different degrees of leeway because it's Hollywood and status matters. But making it, you know, completely clear that Bruno was possibly homosexual, or was making it clear that he was homosexual, if that was the movie's sort of view, then that never would have flown. So that's how that goes. Okay, let's see. Dana, you have a question or comment?
You hear me?
Yes.
Well, here it comes, Andrew. No, I'm kidding totally. I thought this movie was fantastic. I mean, you set this movie up for us as if it was going to be a Hitchcock-y disappointment movie. And so I sort of thought, okay, I'll watch it. But I was totally enthralled. I never saw this movie. And of course, I've seen a million of these Hitchcock movies with you. So I knew a lot. And what I really loved was a lot of the things that you have explained and how wonderfully they worked through this movie. All right, so I made a whole list here, and I'm not going to go through the whole list. But first of all, I have decided, this is all me, my opinion, Hitchcock movies for me are better when they're black and white. That's one thing I find that I like. And also the other thing that I really find that I like is I like them better when the big name stars are pushed out. So I don't think I would have liked it as much with William Holden. And I think I'm delighted that there wasn't some gorgeous blonde femme fatale type person, because I think he was forced to do different things, or at least I saw that he did different things. He really, movie watching with a Hitchcock movie is great for me, because if you decide to drop the thread about the plot or about something, there is something else for you to pay attention to in his movies. Little things, big things. The idea of the doubles, I just think it was repeated and repeated in this movie over and over and over again. Even the idea of glasses, the glasses themselves are a double image, and then two women wore glasses. So there was doubling there. The doubling of the two men and the homoerotic thing, which I actually think was suggested on both sides because of a lot of the camera shots. I don't know if this was part of it, but they were put together. Their bodies were so close together in so many camera shots that they were sort of put together. So even if I wasn't following the plot, I was so completely interested in what some of the photography was. Some of the costume choices, some of the incredible moments you've mentioned, you guys have all mentioned some of them, but I have to give a shout out to that bathrobe. That bathrobe was fantastic, I thought, with the cigarettes all over it. So, you know, again, that was something to watch. And then the other thing that I thought this movie did, rather than telling, it did a lot of showing, visual showing. And I've learned with Hitchcock, that's just a treat. A whole lot, for example, of the relationship between Bruno and his mother came across just in that little moment when she was doing his nails. You didn't even need to know any more than that, but there he was, a grown man sitting there with his mother. She was his manicurist, and the way the interchange there, it said it all. The suspense was terrific. I have to say that I was as on edge in this movie as I was in Jaws. And I mean it. So I really was on the edge of my seat. I love things that he did with time. The tennis match was done sort of in real time. Everything, and he decides to, you know, at the same time juxtapose that with the lighter falling. That's sort of in real time with the fingers dangling. And then suddenly, after those scenes are over, it goes to a whole different sense of time. I just found this movie to be an utterly enjoyable, better than darn good. You described it as darn entertaining. I really thought this movie was fantastically done. Interesting, fun. And I don't know, I'm so glad I missed it, because this was sort of a treat coming out of nowhere. And I'm so glad I know so many things about it now, thanks to you and knowing you for all these years. So anyway, I just love this movie. Bye.
Well, bye. Thanks very much, Dana. Yeah, I mean, you're not alone. I mean, in his review from 2004, Ebert says it belongs on the top shelf of Hitchcock movies, and it received mixed reviews when it was first released, and it did commercially, it did pretty well, well enough to sort of begin to change the trajectory of Hitchcock's career. But it received mixed reviews. Now, of course, it's recognized as a much better movie than it had been at the time. But part of that is because of Hitchcock's sort of, you know, the critical view of Hitchcock has become much higher than it had been sort of in the middle of his run. But this movie has a lot of things, and you really identified a lot of them, Dana, going for it. And that's one of the reasons I like it so much. But yes, the doubles, something you see in Hitchcock in North by Northwest, and The Lady Vanishes, and The Wrong Man, and, you know, Shadow of a Doubt, a bunch of other movies. The danger in everyday places, whether it's accidentally, you know, meeting someone on a train or at a carnival, the sort of menace that come to be represented by everyday objects. The glasses in this movie aren't exactly the shower in Psycho, but they are a trigger, and they are the sort of the lens, if you'll pardon the expression, through which we see one murder and the trigger for almost a couple of others. And yeah, there's a lot going on here, and a lot that's done well. And I'm glad you found that to be the case as well, Dan. I appreciate it. Laura, you have a question or comment?
I just wanted to say when I saw that the film discussion was going to be about Strangers on a Train tonight, I was really excited because I do love it. And I think for me, a big piece of it is Robert Walker. And I feel like he's a really underrated actor, but it's probably also due to the fact that he was so young when he passed away and like in a rather tragic fashion. So I just really love this movie. Agree the fact that I think it's like I like the fact that it's in black and white versus being in color because it just kind of adds to the spookiness of it. And I would like to think that if Robert Walker was alive when Alfred Hitchcock did Psycho, that he would have been a good contender against Anthony Perkins for Norman Bates.
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with you that Robert Walker is, for me, this was the first movie I'd ever seen him in. And I found him to be a revelation. I particularly, and this isn't so, so nice, but I don't think Farley Granger is the most sort of, charismatic or sparkling cinematic personality. And I don't think he's supposed to be. He's certainly not supposed to be in this movie. But Robert Walker just jumps off the screen and you sort of almost can't believe his performance, especially, when you're sort of, we're sort of used to thinking what we're thinking in 1950s. And it's not a stunning performance the way, Brando's performances are for the method acting, or Clift or Dean or any of those who were sort of changing the whole approach to depicting emotion and experience on screen. It's I don't know. It's the notes he hits. It's what he chooses to emphasize in the scene. I mean, I think about the way he reacts when he sees his mother's the painting his mother's done, and just what a bold and colorful, in a black and white movie, bold and colorful from a character perspective moment that is. I think he's a huge part of what makes this movie work. And Hitchcock, he's someone Hitchcock wanted and got. And as hard as it is for someone like me who so firmly associates him with this movie, is to believe he'd had a reputation to this point for playing sort of gentle, harmless, all-American boys. And those had been the roles he'd starred in prior to this. So Hitchcock wanted him to play against type, and he really does it, and he knocks it out of the park. And Hitchcock saw something in him that suggested he could, portray and really depict with depth and vibrancy this type of character, and he does it. I think he really does. Hirsch's, your questions or comments?
Andrew, a couple of things. The cinematography, and I believe the cinematographer whose name I'm hoping you'll know, if not, I'll look.
Robert Burks.
Yes. Could you comment a little bit about the creative process between a director and a cinematographer? I think this was a long-term cinematographer for Hitchcock, and we were struck by a number of the angles and the scenes, not just the opening, which I think is kind of brilliant with the feet, but also the number of times hands are prominent. At the end, there's the hand trying to get the lighter. There's the hands when he's choking the woman at the party. There's lots of things with hands that are in there. So that creative process was one question. Second question that we thought of was, we also both have always really loved this movie. And we also really like I Confess. And they're only about like 2 years apart. I forget which one comes first, the 1951, 53. Could you talk a little bit about whether Hitchcock's so-called lesser films, we're not calling it that, but I understand that that's a category, were seen that way at the time, or is that a retrospective when you hit this string of Rear Window, North by Northwest, Psycho, The Birds, the Hitchcock biggies that people know, even if they don't know anything else. So those were our first two questions about the cinematography director partnership and creativity. The second thing is about the ranking. And then just in passing, the mother again, it always seems to be such a peculiar character, and the dialogue is so double entendre. in the manicure scene, it seemed to me. Oh, is that too close? No. No, it's always just perfect, Mother. She struck me as the kind of woman that Joseph Cotton describes in that awful scene at the table about the kind of women who deserve to die.
Right.
She was lucky she didn't live, near young Charlie, because I think she would have been next on the list. The last thing is, in the book, apparently, according to the extras on the video disc that we had, Guy does kill Bruno's father, and that was deleted in the film for a couple of reasons, not least of which was obviously some code stuff. But I think it also really changes the story. I hope that's not too many things, but thank you for bringing this film. We really love it.
Well, I'm glad. That's a lot of things, and I know you try to summarize at the end, and I really appreciate it. But I'm probably going to need you to pipe up to remind me of some things. Robert Burks. This is the first movie that Burks, the cinematographer, shoots for Hitchcock, and they would collaborate on about a dozen more or so. He shoots every movie between this one and Marnie in 1964, except for Psycho. But black and white or color, big stars or no, Burks was his man, and he was nominated for an Oscar for this, and this was the only nomination that the movie received. He would go on to be nominated again. I think he wins for color for To Catch a Thief. It's one of those Technicolor ones in the mid 50s. So yes, so the cinematography in this movie is terrific, and you get it from, you talked about the opening with the feet. You talked about I love the shot after Guy leaves Bruno's cabin after lunch, the way Bruno reclines and the camera sort of follows him down, and we just barely see his face, like above the table, sort of like a shark just barely above the water. And here's the thing. The relationship between a director and cinematographer varies. It varies based on the individuals involved. It varies based on the era of Hollywood. So during the studio system, the lines of the jobs would have been much firmer than they would be later. It also depends. A number of directors start out as cinematographers. Robert Wise, Barry Sonnenfeld, Peter Hyams. There's a bunch that more that could come to mind, and a number of directors do their own cinematography, like Steven Soderbergh and Robert Rodriguez. So there was a good deal of overlap there. But the way it's typically supposed to work is the way it works with the director and most other people on a set, which is that the director is in charge of looking at the script and trying to translate that script into its cinematic, its visual representation, and has ideas for how that should occur. But the specific implementation of those ideas should be up to the cinematographer. So a sort of standard example would be, give me a close-up of that character. Well, there's a lot of room, a lot of variation within the term close-up. Cinematographer would decide that. Close-up, is it straight on? Is it slightly this way or slightly that way? So the implementation and those decisions would be the cinematographers taking the sort of direction, instruction, marching orders from the director, who I think is a way to think of as the sort of chief creative officer of the movie. I see the question, does the director participate in the storyboarding? Not typically. They would be among the first, if not the first, beside the director to see the storyboards, because they have to think about how to implement those things. But a lot of times, directors, particularly obviously those who weren't cinematographers, have an idea of how they want something to look, but they have no idea how to achieve it technically, right? They say, oh, have you seen this? I want this to be dark like that shot from this movie that people know. Or I want the camera to move, but I want that to be in focus the whole time, or, what have you. And so, the cinematographer really is in charge of everything having to do with the lights and the camera, and it is up to him or her to implement the sort of creative decisions and directions and the vision that the director is trying to go for. Now, that sort of makes it sound like they don't bring their own creativity to it, and that's not true. That's not true at all. But a surprising number of cinematographers don't think of themselves, and certainly at the time this movie was being made, the vast majority would not have thought of themselves as creative people. They would have thought of themselves as craftspeople who are given a charge and execute it. That doesn't mean that there's not a difference among them. That doesn't mean that everyone can achieve the same thing. That doesn't mean that everyone can achieve the same thing the same way, or is capable of achieving the same thing, or would do the same thing in the same way. But they wouldn't think of themselves as, they wouldn't have thought of themselves as artists. They would have thought of themselves as part of the team implementing the vision. What else? Oh, the question about the greater and lesser Hitchcocks. Yes, I mean, much of that much of that comes after the fact. Much of that is looking back. In the moment, nobody's really looking, particularly at this time in the 1950s when movies aren't thought of in the same potentially artistic terms that sometimes they're thought of today. I mean, if you read movie reviews from that time, I mean, a lot of it has to do with, questions of entertainment value and originality and quality and sort of bang for the buck and things like that. And that's not what most of us think of, or at least not what most of us, I think, read criticism for now. So the very notion of film criticism has changed. But at that time, you don't know. I mean, you have some idea that Hitchcock is an exceptional filmmaker. And it's not as much of a stretch, I think, by 1951, although it's still relatively early in his American career, if you think about it. But is it as much of a stretch in 1951 to say in 70 years, people will still be looking at Hitchcock movies as it was to say in 1941, when Citizen Kane came out, in 80 years, people will still be looking at this movie? That was probably more of a stretch. But the short answer to your question, and I realize I've moved long past giving short answers, the short answer to your question is a lot of that would have been in retrospect. Those movies would have been assessed at that time sort of as they came on their own terms. Would there have been references made or comparisons made to this is a thriller in the tradition of Hitchcock's, this movie is, would someone reviewing North by Northwest in 1959 say that it harkens back to the sort of combination of comedy and romance and adventure that you saw in the 39 Steps or the Lady Vanishes? Yes, they might say that. But remember, it wasn't as easy for critics to see movies then either. It wasn't easy for audiences to see movies, and it wasn't easy for critics to see movies. So if a critic writing in 1959 had a good memory of, The Lady Vanishes from 1938, from 21 years earlier, that would really be something, and that would be rare. So the ability to compare a filmmaker's work wasn't as present. It wasn't as easy to do that as it was at that time. So yeah, a lot of that is in retrospect. Okay, I talked so long that a bunch of people put their hands down, but Arlene still has her hand up. Arlene, do you have a question or comment?
I have several of them. First of all, that has been a long-time favorite of mine, and I have also read the book by Patricia Highsmith. But the first thing I'd like to comment about, since you've been talking about film codes, is that there's never, that I've heard of, been any comment about the police firing into a crowd of people on a carousel with children there and innocent bystanders. And that has never been an issue as far as that happening in a film. So I'd like that commented on. Second of all, my comments about the change in story between what Patricia Highsmith wrote and the involvement between Guy and Bruno, which was certainly a lot different. I'd like to know whether Hitchcock himself made the difference in story, or he put it up to whoever was writing and then approved and or disapproved of what was presented to him. And also, I want to comment about the suspense action that I really thought acted so well throughout the film, because it was one of these things that really kept me engrossed. And the final comment is about Hitchcock and his films, is that it's the kind of film that I can watch again and again and again and see more into as I rewatch films that I'm familiar with. This one, as well as a few of the others like Vertigo and even North by Northwest. So just thought I'd mention all that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for doing it, Arlene. Yeah, every time I watch this movie, I am reminded about that moment with the cop shooting onto the crowded carousel with kids and a crowd around and all that. And I agree with you. It's ludicrous. The problem is, I would imagine, that Hitchcock was determined to have the final set piece of this be an out of control carousel. And how is that going to happen? There's really only, I can think of, two ways for it to happen. One is it happens by chance. The thing just happens to break down. A key component happens to break at that moment, which is very ridiculous. Or something happens that leads to the controls being mishandled, et cetera, et cetera. And so they went with choice B. Not the best choice. Some people would say, well, if those are your only two choices, don't do it. That's a fair point. But we sort of have gone so far along in the movie at that point, most of us are willing to kind of let that go. But you're right. And when you see it, it's sort of a shocking thing. Absolutely. I can't remember.
I talked about the suspense and even the way it was filmed to create the suspense, like the carousel horses going up and down, and the film being shot almost under the hooves of the horses. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you see throughout.
I mean, one of the things that Hitchcock's known for, and I alluded to it earlier, is finding there's two things he really likes. He likes exploring the evil, or the potential for evil, or the capability for horrible wrongdoing in every person. And this movie does that. And he likes thinking about the danger or the eeriness or the hazard in everyday places. And so, most of us, I think, and I've seen a little bit of this in the chat, have no trouble believing that a carnival is a creepy place. But Hitchcock takes those opportunities to really sort of make that clear through those different shots on the carousel. Shots that, for someone so interested in plot, to take time to show those, sort of the hooves, the sort of pounding of the hooves, and the sort of, distorted close-ups of the horses. He's interested in plot, but he's also interested in suspense and in fear. Thinking about those sort of departures from the characters makes me think of the shower scene in Psycho, when we get the shots of the shower head. Why are those there? And Hitchcock just has a sense as a filmmaker that having those little shots in there will ratchet up the tension or the discomfort of the viewer.
And in this film, he does it more than once, and repeatedly, actually, more than some of his other films even. Yeah,
I think that's true. And perhaps it's because, this movie has a lot of, in some sense, it's a movie about sort of regular, it's not spies, and it's not espionage, and it's not, it's not sort of known criminals and all those sorts of things. It's really sort of, relatively speaking, about kind of unexceptional people. And so he ratchets it up where he can. And there aren't a ton of big set pieces. I mean, North by Northwest is a movie, of course, much later in his career when he has a lot of opportunity to have a number of big set pieces, but he does it in some of his earlier films too, like Sabotage and things like that. This doesn't have a lot of those. So he takes his opportunities where he has them. Thanks a lot.
And the
Arlie.
other was
Oh.
about the storyline, what influence Hitchcock had. Was it Hitchcock's choice that Bruno die at that point in the story? Because in Highsmith's story, he and Guy go on for a much longer time with some sort of relationship.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there couldn't be the longer you have a relationship between the two of them, the harder time you're going to have with plausible deniability regarding an absence of homosexual content. And so that was a concern. But really, the biggest concern is in a Hollywood movie of this time, even though it's been loosened, the code still dictates that bad people are punished. And if Guy continued to sort of interact with Bruno willingly, if he knew what he was and what he had done and what he was trying to do, then Guy would have to be punished at the end as well. Bruno needs to either go to jail or die. Hitchcock actually wanted the movie to end with the shot of Guy walking away right after Bruno dies, saying to the guy who ran the boats, the guy says, hey buddy, who was that guy? And he says, that was Bruno Anthony. He was a very clever fellow. That's where Hitchcock wanted the movie to end. Warner Brothers didn't want it to end there. And I think Hitchcock liked that note of sort of Bruno's cleverness, suggesting that Bruno's cleverness or, instability was his own undoing, which would have been a sort of neat lesson about human nature that Hitchcock would have, I think, appreciated, but also would have been completely in line with the code that he would pay the ultimate price for his malfeasance. So that's why that had to happen in the movie. Thanks very much, Arlene.
You're welcome.
Let's see. Gloria, you have a question or comment? If you'd like to unmute. Okay. Let's see. James, did you have a question or comment?
Yes. Hi. I wanted to ask you to comment on I think you brought up the idea of doubles before. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and this idea of good and evil and the good guy and the bad guy. One of the things I always thought was interesting about Hitchcock is how the good guy, the innocent person, and the guilty person are always linked, all the way back to 39 Steps. And you see it in this movie. You can see it in North by Northwest, where it really gets close, where Roger Thornhill, actually, there is no bad guy. Like, there is no bad spy for him. He actually becomes the other guy. And then in Psycho, Norman and the mother are sharing like the same mind in a way. So I want to get your ideas on this idea of using the doubles to complicate and blur the moral theme of good versus evil.
Sure. Well, it sort of goes, in a way, it kind of ties into something that was brought up earlier at the very beginning of the discussion about one of the things Hitchcock's father would do. Hitchcock was raised Catholic. He was raised in a Stern household. His father would do that. His father would write a note saying Alfred's been bad. He'd write a note, he'd seal it in or fold it up, give it to Alfred and say, go into town and give this to the constable. And Alfred would give it to the constable. The constable will read it, and it would say, Alfred's been bad. Please put him in a cell till I come to get him. His mother would make Alfred, she would be lying in bed. She would make Alfred stand at the foot of her bed and talk to her for long periods of time. And if he'd been bad, she would sometimes just make him stand there for long periods of time, saying and doing nothing. So, I don't think any of these, in the grand scheme of what a parent can do to a child, particularly, over 100 years ago, I don't think these are the worst things on record. They're certainly not the worst things on record. But do they, combined with the strict Jesuit education, suggest some ways in which Alfred Hitchcock's views of right and wrong, or I guess more to the point, wrong, and the way wrong exists in all people, gets sort of transmogrified into his view of the world. And I think he believes, as many people believe of many different faiths, that there is good and evil in all people. And the difference between the quote unquote good ones and the bad ones is, who controls it, who gives into it, and so on and so forth. So part of the terror of being, wrongly accused is that, it might stick, right? If it's never going to stick, there's no chance of it sticking. There's no chance of any repercussions from that wrongful accusation harming you or being applied to you, then it's not really so scary. The issue is, what if they know? What if the people accusing me, I didn't do that thing, but I've done these other things? And that's sort of where the notion of the double comes in, this idea that there are these people. And now in some movies, there's no connection really between the doubles until they meet in the movie. But in other, and this movie's like that, except that the two people do happen to have something in common, that they have people who they view are making their lives completely unfairly and, excessively difficult. Now, one of the reasons I like this movie is that I think Miriam really is, she's a nasty character, and she is doing nasty things to Guy. And while, as Guy says, that doesn't mean she should be killed, I think we would all agree probably if we take what Bruno's father says at face value, he probably shouldn't be killed for what his views and his actions are either. But they have that thing in common. And, how far away from being Bruno is Guy? We get that moment early in the film when he's on the phone to Anne and he's yelling, he wished he could strangle her. And he starts to sort of, attack her somewhat or become aggressive with her in the record store, and the owner has to come in. So the concern isn't these things only work, or I should say they only are at their most effective. And Hitchcock's interested in having his stories be the most effective when there is some connection, when there's a little, perhaps little tiny kernel or strand of the possibility of truth there. Is anyone going to literally confuse these two people looking at them? No. Are they as far apart as Guy thought he was from Bruno before, the sort of person Bruno is before he met him? Well, no, that's not true either. So I think all of these things, and as Janet says in the chat, this notion of guilt, it's something a lot of filmmakers spend a lot of time on. Martin Scorsese is another one. And so I think that's how this sort of all ties together, and why Hitchcock is so often so interested in the notion of doubles, because, he's not ready to say there, but for the grace of God go I, but for, different parents or different brain chemistry or what have you, go I. And, sometimes it's not the paths diverge, but they're not always that far apart.
Thank you.
Sure. Judy, you have a question or comment?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, Judy, I think you muted again.
Okay, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Great. Well, I'm one of those people who up to this last watching of the movie was not in love with Strangers on a Train. It's not one of my favorite Hitchcock films, as I have expressed to you. But any Hitchcock movie for me is better than 50 other movies. So so I will add that in. But I did realize after this discussion tonight that perhaps some of the things that have disturbed me about this movie were actually Hitchcock intentionally trying to sort of ruffle me up and make me uncomfortable as a viewer. I have found that I thought the casting of Farley Granger and Ruth Roman wasn't great. But now that I'm thinking about it, Guy is intentionally passive and weak because he can't stand up against Bruno, who is so incredibly a psychopath. I mean, Bruno is the quintessential psychopath, and Guy sort of doesn't hold a candle to him. And I think that's probably Hitchcock, that's intentional Hitchcock. I also think that the casting of, I think that Ruth Roman doesn't add too much to the role, but I don't know if her character is all that much in the movie. I think there are other characters in the movie that are more interesting. Patricia Hitchcock is given some phenomenal lines. She's like amazing. She's fabulous. And so I'm being forced to sort of rethink my response to this movie and why I was so disturbed by it, which is interesting for me. I also think I loved the very beginning, the exposition in the beginning with the two sets of two pairs of shoes walking and the intersecting train tracks. I thought that was brilliant. And there are other things in the movie, other themes that remind me of Shadow of a Doubt, and Shadow of a Doubt is one of my most favorite movies. So I'm trying to sort of understand why this movie disturbed me, and perhaps these are, maybe these are some of the reasons I have to rethink it.
Well, I appreciate that, Judy, and I think one of the things that we all, as viewers, we all have kind of trouble distinguishing is sort of, a lot of times we have trouble when we like something, we sometimes have trouble figuring out why we like it. When we don't like something, sometimes have trouble figuring out why we don't like it. And the problem with that is, particularly on the sort of negative side of that scale, is that something ends and we feel bad or off. Our first thought is, well, I obviously didn't care for that. But what if the desired, outcome is that you feel uncomfortable, that you feel disturbed? I mean, Hitchcock, one of the reasons that Hitchcock has gained and maintained the reputation he has is he was really trying to use cinema to sort of get in our heads as viewers. And, sometimes, nobody says, nobody watches, Psycho and says, I feel wonderful, so obviously it was a great movie. I mean, we can make the distinction for some reasons, but, when it's perhaps a bit more of a subtle, discomfort, or we're sort of put off and we don't quite know why, a lot of times we can confuse one or the other. People said at the beginning, and that I undersold the movie. If I'm being honest, I have to say that there are things that don't work. I think Granger not being the most effervescent actor, I think that works for the movie. I, however, don't think necessarily that the Ruth Roman's flatness is intentional. I think Hitchcock didn't like her. She was the one, as Farley Granger said, that on the Hitchcock movies he worked on, there always had to be somebody that Hitchcock sort of harassed. Apparently that was Ruth Roman on this. Warner Brothers made him use her in this role. He didn't want to, and I guess he sort of took that out on her. I don't want to be too hard on her, and can't think of anything else I've seen her in to sort of, try to, reduce her to this role. But there are things that aren't that aren't necessarily the best. That being said, I think sometimes, coming away with I'm always curious. I'm always, when a movie ends, I want to be able to figure out why I found it so off-putting. And sometimes it's very simple. I've always found that actor annoying, whatever. But sometimes, it tells me something about what the movie was trying to do. I mean, for me, and this is pretty simple, unless it's like clearly a genre thing like this one was, where there has to be someone who's terrible and there's also some people who are decent. When I'm supposed to watch a story and the protagonist, who I'm supposed to at least in some way identify with, or at the very least I'm exposed to nonstop throughout the movie, is a horrible human being, I have trouble with that. And
Yes.
I know that I need to think about why this story chose to do that, and what does it do it in a way that makes the story makes the movie, worth considering, and so on and so forth. But that's sort of a thing for me. And we all have those things, and maybe there were some of those things or one of those things in this movie for you.
Yes, probably. So I'm going to rethink it. But I also, one other point that I want to make real quick is, I think it's interesting that Hitchcock has made Guy a popular celebrity type of person whose story is known out there. He's obviously in the press. He's dating the senator's daughter, and he is a well-known celebrity. And be careful with celebrity, because when you are a celebrity, everybody knows your life story, and they can get sort of more information on you, as Robert Walker's character does. So beware the ploys of celebrity.
Oh yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And Hitchcock loves to point out the downside to things that
Yes.
people might not think there are downsides to.
Correct.
Oh, isn't it wonderful? I live in a nice rural town where there are lots of birds. Well, it is until those birds decide to attack you. And
Right.
Isn't it wonderful being this famous person? Well, it might seem that way. You get to go from playing tennis to being a politician, but as you were saying, there's a downside, which is everybody knows who you are and everybody knows your business. And
Right.
you can't even, some of the ways, those of us, some of the ways you or I might be able to get away with reacting in public, this person can't do that, and so on and so forth. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that was
Right.
probably a sort of another kind of reason why he made him someone of note. I think it works on a number of levels, but I'm sure that's one of them. Celebrity is another
Absolutely.
thing. Another
Yeah.
thing that seems nice, but there's a downside to it. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, thanks very much, Judy.
You're welcome.
All right, everybody. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you so much for joining me to talk about this movie that I obviously really, really like. And I'm so glad so many of you found it worthwhile as well. As you can see on the screen, we have a number of film studies opportunities coming up, some of them on site, some of them remotely, and some of them both. So you can find out more about all of these seminars or our film history discussion series on our website, obviously, brynmarfilm.org. You can read full descriptions and sign up. We are very excited to announce that after a 2-year hiatus, this summer we are bringing back the Summer Filmmaking Workshop. This is our annual, at least before the pandemic, our annual summer program for high school students, where they get to work with a wonderful educator and filmmaker at BMFI for 6 weeks to learn all about the various aspects of filmmaking and to make some very interesting and well-made and original movies. You can, if you happen to be a high school student or are the parent or grandparent of a high school student interested in filmmaking, please go to our website, visit the Summer Filmmaking Workshop page, and learn all about it. It's a wonderful program. And you can watch some of the movies, you can read some testimonials from folks who've done it in the past, and you can sign up for one of our information sessions, which we have a few Zoom information sections coming up. The first one at the end of January. So check that out. We're very glad to be able to bring it back. And we are able to bring it back because the theater is open. We've got a lot of great movies that we're showing, a lot of the year-end awards contenders, and we're bringing in a bunch of new ones in the coming weeks, things either that are being newly made available with sort of for their awards push, or maybe some titles that we couldn't get to earlier in the year, but we're really excited to bring to you. So you can see what's going on, what we're showing, and there's a lot there. So please check it out at brynmarfilm.org. And finally, because of you and your friends and neighbors and the other folks who come to BMFI, we have had so far our most successful annual appeal ever, and we thank you so much for that. But if you maybe haven't donated yet to our annual appeal and haven't yet joined our cast of thousands, we would really love for you to do that. We're going to be wrapping up this campaign very soon, and we'd really like to get a few more people to join the cast and to help us sort of ring in 2022 on the best foot we can. I know a number of you who are on this discussion have donated. I've seen the names sort of come through the over the transom, as they say. But you can see some of those who've donated at our Cast of Thousands page, and you can read about the necessity of this campaign and why it means so much to us, and why I hope you'll be willing to make a donation to show a little bit maybe how much BMFI means to you. So many of you, as I said on this discussion, I know already have, but if you haven't and you're able to, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you for those of you who've joined the Cast of Thousands, and to those of you who might now go to our website and perhaps join the cast, perhaps again. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you for our next discussion. Take care.
Can't wait till next time. Thank you.
And
Thank
good night.
you.
Good night.